Wilkes County, Georgia, 1847. The Caldwell estate sat high on a rise above 800 acres of cotton and silence. White columns, the scent of magnolia, the sound of cicadas pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the summer air. But behind those grand pillars was a secret no sermon dared name. Twin daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell. 22 years old, identical down to the faint birthmark above their right eyes. The townspeople adored them, two visions of Southern virtue, flawless and untouchable. But perfection is always camouflage. When their mother died during childbirth, their father, Thomas Caldwell, became their whole world. He was a man who ruled his land like a small kingdom, strict, devout, and feared. He called his daughters his mirrors of heaven. Yet the mirrors were beginning to crack. The first sign came in a letter. April 8, 1847. A housekeeper named Margaret Sullivan wrote to her sister in Savannah, "The young misses have taken to spending strange hours near the quarters. The master seems unconcerned." The quarters, half a mile from the house, where 70 enslaved men and women worked, lived, and dreamed of a sky without chains. That letter was hidden in a family Bible, sealed between pages of Revelation. It would not be found until over a century later, but its warning had already bled into the walls of that house. You see, the twins were not visiting out of pity. They were searching for something forbidden even by thought. Two men, Samuel and Elijah, educated, literate, purchased from South Carolina, and taught to read by the children of their former master. A crime punishable by mutilation or death. But intelligence has a scent, and Catherine followed it straight into the stables one moonless night. There, by the dim flame of a stolen lantern, she found Samuel reading a discarded newspaper. He looked up, terrified. But she didn't to scream. She smiled. That night, something ancient awoke beneath the surface of the Caldwell estate. Not love, not lust, but rebellion disguised as intimacy. And once it began, there was no stopping it. They met where no one dared linger, past the gardens, beyond the edge of the fields, beneath a grove of black oaks that twisted toward the sky like broken fingers. It was here, among roots older than the plantation itself, that Catherine Caldwell began meeting Samuel. And soon after, Elizabeth joined them, with Elijah. 4 souls, bound by secrecy, moving like ghosts through the night. If the housekeeper's whispers reached Thomas Caldwell, he never spoke of it. Perhaps he thought his daughters incapable of sin. Or perhaps he knew and chose silence, because silence preserves power. The diary found in 1964, Catherine's hand, neat and precise, bears fragments of their descent. There are 2 worlds beneath this roof, one gilded, one chained. Samuel says freedom begins when you no longer kneel in your own mind. I begin to understand him. Freedom. That word was poison in the antebellum South, but Catherine tasted it like wine. Each meeting grew more dangerous. Each touch carried the weight of death. Because in 1847 Georgia, the law saw Samuel and Elijah not as men, but as property, and the Caldwells, gods in their own domain. But what happens when gods choose to kneel before the creation they once owned? By February of that year, the housekeeper stopped writing letters altogether. Her last entry mentions the twins disappearing for hours after dark and returning with their dresses damp with dew, the smell of the fields clinging to them like confession. Then came the pact. Not a marriage of law would never allow it, but a union older, darker, and far more binding. Beneath the black oaks, the four gathered one night before the spring rains. They drew blood from their palms, pressed their hands together, and swore to belong to no one but each other. In this place, Catherine wrote, we are not master and slave. We are something that has no name. That entry was dated March 3, 1847. 1 week later, the estate's overseer, James Corwin, disappeared. His horse was found near the river. His body was not. And from that moment, Wilkes County began whispering that the Caldwell twins were cursed. But what they had truly done was much worse. It began with silence. The kind of silence that swallows sound whole, the kind you feel before something terrible happens. March 1847. The moon was full, but the river was black. James Corwin, the Caldwell overseer, hadn't been seen since the evening before. The townsfolk said he'd gone riding toward the lower fields, but his horse returned at dawn without him, trembling, its reins slick with something darker than water. The master, Thomas Caldwell, organized a search. Slaves were sent into the woods, torches in hand. They combed the banks, shouting Corwin's name into the mist. But the river gave nothing back. 3 days later, a bundle washed up on the shore. It wasn't a body, just his hat, and a length of rope, tied in a knot, no man in the county recognized. They called it witchwork. They called it retribution. But no one dared speak of the twins. Not yet. That same week, Catherine's diary changed tone. The neatness of her handwriting dissolved into erratic, slanted lines. He said the river takes only what is claimed. The blood pact binds more than flesh. It binds fate. Father asks questions. We speak lies. The he she wrote of, scholars later believed, was Samuel, the stableman, the reader, the man who taught her that bondage could exist in the mind as much as in the body. And as the nights grew longer, something began to shift inside Catherine and Elizabeth. They started speaking in phrases no one understood, finishing each other's sentences, repeating the same words over and over under their breath. Freedom in unity, unity in fire. Margaret Sullivan, the housekeeper, wrote in her private letter, a letter that wouldn't surface until the 1950s, that she saw the sisters walking barefoot through the fields at midnight, their gowns dragging through wet grass, their faces pale as if lit from beneath. Behind them trailed Samuel and Elijah, silent, unchained. It looked, she wrote, as though the master had lost his daughters to something not of this world. The next morning, Thomas Caldwell sealed off the quarters. He forbade his daughters from leaving the house after sundown. He increased the number of guards, doubled the patrols. But once a pact is made in blood, walls cannot contain it. The twins began meeting Samuel and Elijah in secret again. Not for pleasure, not even for love, but for something darker, a purpose. Because by now, the plantation was no longer a house of order. It had become an altar. And what they were preparing to do next would shake the entire county to its knees. There are places where history folds over itself, where soil remembers everything done upon it, For the Caldwell estate, that place was the orchard. Once filled with peach trees that perfumed the air each spring, by 1847 the trees had begun to wither, their bark blackened, their fruit rotting before ripening. Locals said it was blight. The housekeeper, Margaret, said it was punishment. But Catherine believed the orchard was listening. One evening she led her sister there. The air was heavy, charged. She told Elizabeth they would no longer hide what they were, that they could make the world remember them, even if it had to burn to do so. Samuel and Elijah stood beneath the dying trees, waiting. They did not kneel. They didn't have to anymore. That night, the twins spoke words not from Scripture, but from memory, the kind of memory that exists beneath language. They recited verses they claimed came to them in dreams, fragments of rebellion, of identity breaking free. "We are the root and the branch," Catherine whispered, "the bound and the binding, the fire and its shadow." To outsiders, it might have looked like madness. To them, it was awakening. They burned one tree that night, a single dying peach tree, its branches twisting upward like arms. The fire crackled bright against the black sky, and in its glow their faces looked the same. Not twin, not mirror, but merged. When Thomas Caldwell saw the flames from his study window, he thought lightning had struck. But when he reached the orchard, the fire had already died. Only smoke lingered, and 4 sets of footprints circled the ashes, each burned into the soil as if pressed there by heat from within. From that night on, the twins no longer attended church. They no longer played the piano in the parlor or entertained suitors. They began wearing black, their hair bound with simple cord instead of silk. The men, Samuel and Elijah, moved through the house with quiet authority, as if some invisible order had changed hands. The housekeeper resigned within a month. She wrote, "The girls speak of deliverance, but I see only doom." By midsummer, whispers spread through Wilkes County that the Caldwell women were practicing unnatural devotion. The pastor refused to visit. The neighbors stopped sending invitations. And behind closed doors, the twins began planning the one act that would seal their fate and erase the Caldwell name from Georgia's high society forever. By late August 1847, the air over Wilkes County had turned heavy as melted lead. Storms rolled in from the west and stayed there, brooding above the hills, refusing to break. Inside the Caldwell house, something else was waiting to burst. Thomas Caldwell had begun to notice changes he could no longer ignore. His daughters spoke little to him. When they did, their words carried a strange calm, as though they pitied him. Servants avoided their gaze. Even the hounds would not go near the orchard. One afternoon, Thomas followed the sound of a voice down the hallway, Elizabeth's, speaking softly through a half-closed door. He heard a man answer her, a man's voice inside his own house. He slammed the door open. Samuel stood beside her, coatless, hands steady. No fear in his eyes, only recognition. For a moment, everything inside Thomas froze. Then came the rage, centuries of hierarchy clawing to preserve itself. He shouted for the guards, for the overseer who was already dead, for the order he believed the world owed him. But no one came. The household had grown strangely quiet these past weeks. People vanished without notice, fled to neighboring farms, or simply stopped answering his calls. It was as if the estate itself refused to take sides. That night, lightning finally split the sky. Rain struck the windows like thrown gravel. And in the grand hall, the sisters appeared before their father dressed in black, hair unbound, eyes reflecting the storm. Behind them, Samuel and Elijah waited, not as servants, but as witnesses. Catherine spoke first. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the thunder. "You taught us that the Lord made man to rule, Father, but you never asked what he made women to remember." Thomas tried to speak, but the wind drowned him. The chandeliers swayed. A window shattered inward. Outside, the orchard flared white for an instant. The old ashes, rekindled by lightning, glowing like an open wound. No record says what happened next. Only that by morning, the main house stood untouched, yet emptied of life. The dining table was set for 4. The doors were unlocked. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence thicker than smoke. Neighbors arrived days later and found the estate abandoned. The twins, the 2 men, and Thomas Caldwell were never seen again. But witnesses claimed that on certain nights, when the air smells of rain and peach wood, 2 female figures can be seen walking the hill, hand in hand with shadows taller than themselves. In the days after the storm, Wilkes County behaved the way most places do when faced with something that does not fit the pattern. It refused to look directly at it. Neighbors came up the hill in wagons, stepped through the front doors of the Caldwell estate, and found everything waiting. Chairs pushed in, a kettle cooling on the stove, clothes folded neatly in drawers. No struggle, no blood. Just the faint smell of wet earth and smoke drifting in from the orchard. For a week, they searched the woods. They dragged the river again, the same one that had swallowed the overseer months earlier. Nothing surfaced. Then the sheriff declared the matter closed. He told the newspapers that the family had traveled north under mysterious circumstances. No further explanation was given. The county moved on, or pretended to, but a house remembers, and so does a rumor. Within a year, field hands who had worked the Caldwell land were sold off or vanished into the night. The property changed hands twice, then lay empty for decades. Children dared each other to climb the hill and look through the windows. They swore they saw candlelight moving inside, 2 flames always side by side. In 1892, a local preacher tried to reclaim the house for his congregation. He lasted 3 nights before leaving at dawn, pale and shaking. He told no one what he'd seen, only muttered, "The sin here isn't what they did, it's what we let happen." By the early 1900s, the story had been rewritten. The twins became cautionary phantoms in Sunday sermons, symbols of what happens when purity strays. Samuel and Elijah were reduced to shadows, temptations, demons, men of the night. The county's official records list no marriages, no burials, no trace of any of them. And yet, certain details slipped through the cracks of silence. A census note mentioning 2 light-eyed women tending fields without mast. A ledger signed in careful feminine script. E. Caldwell. Debts settled in full. Pieces of a truth the town tried to bury, but the soil kept spitting it back. Because stories like this never really die. They are edited, censored, and painted over until they look respectable. But beneath every monument, every whitewashed history, there is always a second version, one whispered between the ones who remember, the ones who refuse to bow. The silence that followed the Caldwell twins wasn't peace. It was containment. And for those who listen closely enough, it still leaks through the cracks. When the war ended and the South staggered under its ruins, the victors wrote new laws, and the old families wrote new myths. Wilkes County was no exception. The Caldwell estate, once a monument to order, became a liability, a question mark too large for polite conversation. By 1866, northern surveyors arrived to catalog property for tax repossession. They found the plantation stripped bare, the orchards dead, the stables collapsed, and a single foundation stone etched with the initials ECC, half buried in the mud. The official report described it as abandoned due to flood damage. No mention of the missing heirs. No mention of what locals still whispered each harvest. The twins never left. During Reconstruction, memory itself became currency. Families like the Caldwells could not be allowed to vanish into scandal. They had to be rebranded. So the story changed. Historical registers listed Thomas Caldwell as a casualty of fever. His daughters were recast as charitable benefactors who perished nursing the sick. The archives of Savannah's Historical Society still hold the pamphlet printed in 1871, The Virtuous Sisters of Wilkes Hill, a Southern example of piety amidst turmoil. The lie was elegant, and for a time it worked. But beneath the new narrative lay a more dangerous idea, that a pair of women and two enslaved men had once challenged the entire social architecture of ownership and obedience. To admit that would have meant admitting that the hierarchy itself was a myth. So the county historians erased names, burned ledgers, replaced entries. Control was restored not by chains, but by editing. This is how power survives. It rewrites the evidence, then teaches the next generation that the fiction was always fact. Every courthouse archive, every marble statue, every sanitized textbook becomes a lock on the same old door. Even today, if you visit the state archives, you'll find the Caldwell file labeled simply Lost Records, 1865 to 1868. A neat absence, a perfect silence. But here's the truth the archivists never understood. Erasure isn't destruction. It's camouflage. Some nights, the archivists report hearing the rustle of paper long after the lights go out, as if someone is turning pages, searching for a name. A handprint smudged in red dust sometimes appears on the spine of that missing ledger. They wipe it away each morning. It always returns. Because history's ghosts don't haunt for vengeance. They haunt to remind you who rewrote them. By the mid-20th century, the world had changed its vocabulary for power, but not its appetite for it. Factories replaced fields, ledgers became typewriters, and men in pressed suits continued the same quiet work of shaping what could and could not be remembered. Yet buried things have a rhythm. Every few generations, they tap from below. In 1952, a courthouse renovation in Washington, Georgia, unearthed a box sealed with pitch. Inside, rotted paper, water-stained scrolls, and a single envelope marked Caldwell. The clerk who opened it later told reporters that the handwriting seemed to move under the light. The documents were mostly useless fragments: a housekeeper's letter, a half-charred diary page, a receipt for 2 horses. But one line, written in a woman's hand, stopped him cold. "We sign so the world will not forget our true names: Elizabeth, Catherine, Samuel, Elijah." It was the first time in a century those 4 names had appeared together in ink. The archivist filed the discovery away, but word spread through academic circles. Within months, a graduate researcher from Emory University drove down to Wilkes County, tracing the rumors that the twins had not died, but moved beneath the record. He found the ruins of the orchard, the blackened soil still sour after 100 years. He found a rusted hinge where the main gate once stood. And he found locals, old men who swore their grandfathers had seen 2 women in mourning clothes walking the ridge the night before Sherman's march. Each story contradicted the next, yet all of them agreed on one point: the names were never to be spoken after sundown. The researcher collected everything and wrote a paper titled, "The Lost Matriarchs of Georgia." It was meant to be academic, detached, clinical. But after its publication, his career stalled. His notes disappeared from the university archives. He left academia entirely, claiming that certain histories erase the man who tells them. Still, copies of his draft circulated quietly. By the 1970s, civil rights historians began referencing the Caldwell incident as an allegory for suppressed interracial unions and class defiance. By the 1990s, the story was whispered again, not as folklore, but as a coded metaphor for hidden power. The names had returned. And each time they were spoken aloud, the silence around them thinned just a little more. Every century produces a handful of people who refuse to accept the official version. They aren't rebels in the cinematic sense, no banners, no speeches. They are researchers, archivists, and night readers, men and women who sit in basements breathing dust, hunting for a pattern that others insist does not exist. By the early 2000s, a small circle of them began comparing notes on Southern records lost during Reconstruction. They called themselves the ones who dig. They weren't chasing ghosts. They were chasing evidence of erasure. And the Caldwell case became their proving ground. They started with county property maps and discovered that the 800 acres once owned by Thomas Caldwell were still, somehow, in legal limbo. Every deed since 1868 had a missing signature, a name that had been replaced by a mark, a single looping symbol resembling 2 interlocked rings. No family crest in Georgia matched it, but in one surviving letter from the plantation's housekeeper, the same mark appears beside the initials E.C. They traced the signature through insurance registries, through auction records, even into federal land grants from the 1930s. The mark kept surfacing, attached to shell companies, anonymous trusts, donations to universities and hospitals. Money moving quietly, preserving itself. A signature that outlived its owners. When the team presented their findings at a historical conference in Atlanta, half the attendees dismissed them as romanticizing myth. The other half stayed after the lights went down, asking in low voices whether they had found anything else, letters, bloodlines, proof of the forbidden marriages whispered about for generations. One researcher, a genealogist named Harris, said something that silenced the room. It's not about whether they married. It's about who's been protecting their memory for 150 years, and why. Becca used the paper trail suggested intention. The properties tied to the symbol were all located on former plantation land, all used for education or refuge. Orphanages, schools, libraries, the quiet machinery of rebuilding mines. As if someone had taken the wealth of the Caldwell estate and redistributed it slowly, invisibly, through generations. That's when the whispers began again. That the pact beneath the oaks had never truly ended. It had only changed form. Not a curse, a continuation. History had erased the faces, but the ones who dig were beginning to see the outline of a design too deliberate to be accident. A lineage not of blood, but of intention. Every document that survives the fire carries a scar a pattern of what refused to burn. When Harris and the other researchers laid the Caldwell fragments side by side under ultraviolet light, they saw that the same faint watermark, those two interlocked rings, appeared even on pages printed decades apart. The symbol wasn't drawn, it was pressed into the paper itself, like a hidden signature from the original mill. They traced the watermark to a paperworks company in Charleston that had gone bankrupt in 1850. Its ledgers listed only one private client during its final year, T.C. Caldwell, Wilkescombe. The order description read simply, "Custom stationery for the daughters." The deeper they looked, the more the pattern repeated. Bound ledgers in Savannah, hymn books in Augusta, even birth certificates from a freedmen's school in 1872, all bore the same faint rings, invisible until exposed to blue light. The pattern wasn't a mark of property, it was a map of transmission. Late one night in the archive basement, Harris pinned copies of the watermarked pages to a corkboard. When connected by county and year, the marks formed a line arcing across Georgia into Alabama, then bending north toward the Carolinas, a corridor of schools, safe houses, and quiet philanthropies that had appeared after the war with no clear founder. Each bore the same understated motto carved above its doors, "Root and Branch." A librarian watching from the doorway whispered, "That was the phrase from the diary, wasn't it?" It was. The researchers realized that what began as a forbidden union might have evolved into an underground network, people using the very tools of the old order to undo it from within. Not a secret society in the dramatic sense, but a lineage of memory passing through ledgers, teaching positions, endowments, a resistance disguised as bureaucracy. They brought their findings to the State Historical Board. Within weeks, access to several archives was temporarily suspended for preservation work. Emails stopped receiving replies. One of the team members returned to his office to find every photocopy and microfilm reel replaced with fresh folders labeled "Under Review." Harris wrote in his final field note, before disappearing from public view, "The ashes were never cold. They were arranged. What we call history is just the top layer of the pattern." By the time Harris vanished, most of the team had retreated to safer topics. University funding can disappear faster than evidence, and nobody wanted their name tied to a scandal involving state records. But one researcher, an older woman named Miriam Quinn, kept the files. She'd worked in the Georgia State Archives for 30 years and understood how documents breathe, how they shift when someone wants them gone. Miriam contacted a journalist in Savannah under the pretense of discussing a restoration grant. She handed him a box of photocopies, brittle folders stamped "Confidential Retention," and said only, "You think you're chasing ghosts. What you're really chasing is a memory system designed to protect itself." Inside her notes was a list of board members from a dozen educational foundations, modern institutions whose funding traced back to anonymous trusts created in the 1870s. Each trust used that same paper mill watermark as its corporate seal. Each one contributed to programs focused on literacy, social reform, and civic training. Miriam's handwriting in the margins was steady but urgent. This isn't conspiracy, it's continuity. A network built to keep knowledge moving when governments stall. She believed that descendants of Samuel and Elijah had quietly managed these trusts for generations, their names hidden in plain sight through legal aliases and changed spellings. Whenever an archive closed its doors, another opened. Whenever a record was sealed, A duplicate appeared in an unrelated library collection under a new accession number, a living circuit. But there was another layer that frightened her. In the last pages of her journal, she described visitors, men in business attire asking polite questions about donation ledgers, about who still had keys to the basement vault. They never identified themselves. She wrote, "They weren't historians. They already knew what was missing." A week later, she resigned from the archives, moved to the coast, and left a letter with a colleague. It read simply, "If they ever tell you the Caldwell records never existed, ask them why they still pay to keep the room locked." The journalist she'd contacted tried to publish her findings, but his editor refused. The article was pulled hours before printing. When he called Miriam's home, the line had been disconnected. And still, every year since then, anonymous donations flow quietly into the State Preservation Fund, always the same amount, always signed with a looping mark that looks like two rings pressed together. The warning stands written at the bottom of Miriam's last surviving page. The past isn't buried. It's being managed. The journalist kept Miriam's box locked in his apartment closet for 3 months. Every night he told himself to leave it alone. Every morning he caught himself staring at the symbol on the folders, the two rings pressed together. It began to show up elsewhere. A watermark on the bottom corner of a museum brochure, the spine of a newly printed textbook, the header of a literacy nonprofit's website. Coincidence, he thought, until he traced the donor lists. The same network of trusts funded nearly every cultural institution in the state, museums, archives, public universities, even regional newspapers. Different names, different boards, same pattern of transfers through foundations in Delaware and New York. And always that faint emblem. When he contacted a friend inside one of the papers, she laughed at first. Then she stopped. The funding for their investigative unit, she said, came from a foundation that required editorial independence to remain untouched. No oversight, no signatures. Every year, a quiet wire transfer arrived, signed only with the initials RB for root and branch. The journalist realized that the Caldwell legacy had evolved. What began as a rebellion of 4 people had become a decentralized engine for shaping how truth was curated. Not a conspiracy, but a philosophy. Control the archive, and you control the story. Control the story, and you decide what the public calls reality. He dug into the educational material funded by those trusts. Curricula that emphasized critical thinking but discouraged lineage study. Museum exhibits that celebrated progress yet omitted certain names. A pattern of omission so subtle it looked like design. Late one night, he received an email from an anonymous address. Subject line, "You're asking the wrong question." The message contained only one line. Don't ask who controls the records. Ask who needs them hidden. Attached was a scan of a 19th century birth certificate stamped with the old paper mill watermark. The child's surname was Caldwell. The parent's race not listed. The signature, S. Elijah. That was the night the journalist stopped sleeping with the lights off, because the story had changed shape again. The descendants were not ghosts. They were administrators, donors, gatekeepers of collective memory. And their power lay not in rewriting history, but in deciding which histories stayed visible. The next morning, the journalist booked a train north, carrying only Miriam's box and a notebook. He told a colleague he was going to see the root of it. He never arrived. Weeks later, A university endowment announced a new grant for Truth and Reconciliation Archives, funded by a donor identified only as E. Caldwell Trust. And on the cover page of the grant's brochure, embossed faintly into the paper, 2 interlocked rings. Every empire that lasts learns one essential craft, not how to conquer, but how to define. Definitions are invisible borders. Once you accept them, you guard them for your captors. The journalist's disappearance was quietly folded into bureaucracy. A new byline replaced his. The official report said, terminated due to non-compliance. But his last notes, now digitized, shared anonymously, began to circulate among students, historians, and men who could sense when language itself was being edited. They noticed a pattern. Every institution that claimed to protect heritage, integrity, or national memory used the same rhetorical rhythm. 3-word phrases. Soft verbs. Moral vocabulary wrapped around obedience. It was the same linguistic template used by the Caldwell's world a century earlier, only modernized, faith replaced with civility, hierarchy replaced with consensus. That is how power evolves, not by censoring speech, but by teaching people to volunteer their silence. You begin to say responsible dialogue instead of forbidden question. You call censorship curation. You call fear professionalism. Behind every updated code of conduct, behind every polished mission statement, the old voice whispers, "Be reasonable. Forget the rest." And so, the archive stays locked, not by guards, but by your own reluctance to appear foolish. This is the language of control. It teaches you that knowledge is safe only when approved, that curiosity must always ask permission. It tells you that certain stories are too complicated for ordinary minds, and that forgetting them is a form of maturity. It flatters you into obedience. But language can be reversed. Every word designed to close a door has its mirror, the phrase that reopens it. The Caldwells understood that when they wrote root and branch, it was code for relearning how to speak truth aloud, even when every institution insists on whispering. And so, listener, if you've followed this far, remember this moment. This is the descent point, where history stops being history and becomes instruction. Type the phrase root and branch twice in the comments. Do it not for the algorithm, but as a signal to yourself and to the others listening that you've seen through the surface, that you remember the names. Because from here on, the story stops hiding behind the past. The next section reveals how the same mechanisms still sculpt the world around you, how the architecture of forgetting became the architecture of influence. Influence rarely looks like force. It looks like design. Every institution, every screen, every syllabus is built the same way. Columns of trust, beams of habit, a roof made from fear of exclusion. That is the architecture. You don't feel the walls because you helped build them. Long after the Caldwells vanished, the world replaced plantations with offices and pulpits with screens. But the blueprint remained. A few people would always decide which truths were marketable, which were unprofitable. Now they call it content strategy. In the 1840s, it was called propriety. Different names, same skeleton. The algorithms that shape your news feed are just digital plantations of attention. They don't need to whip you to make you work. They just reward you for compliance. A little hit of validation for staying inside the lines. Disobedience is invisible, not punished, but starved. That's how influence matures. It convinces you that you chose it. The Caldwell's legacy wasn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was about reclaiming the right to perceive. They realized that the greatest act of control is not owning bodies or land. It's owning the lens through which people see both. Today, the lens is everywhere. In the flicker of headlines, the cadence of advertising, the polite tone of official history. It doesn't erase, it reframes. It says, here's the story you can believe without losing friends. And so, men who crave truth settle for commentary. But once you start tracing patterns, you see the old watermark everywhere. In the spacing of headlines, in the repetition of slogans, in how certain phrases always arrive to calm outrage before outrage becomes action. This architecture isn't evil, it's efficient. A perfect system needs no guards, just good design. And it's been centuries in the making. The question is not whether you can tear it down. The question is whether you can still see the seams. Because the moment you see them, the illusion fractures. And once it fractures, you can't go back. Remember this, the Caldwells disappeared not because they were defeated, but because they learned to move through the cracks of the architecture, to use the walls as corridors, not cages. The next section will show how that architecture extends into the smallest decisions you make, how belief, repetition, and comfort weave into a single system that quietly decides who you are allowed to become. Every structure that lasts eventually learns to live inside its inhabitants. At first, control is external, laws, rules, sermons, eyes watching from towers. But true mastery happens when the tower moves inside your head. That's the quiet trick of every age. Convince a man to monitor his own thoughts, and you no longer need to punish him. He'll do it for you. The Caldwell's story was never only about race or scandal. It was about the moment two women realized that obedience was a mental reflex. Once they recognized it, the hierarchy that ruled their world began to crumble. That's why their memory had to be buried. Not because they broke a taboo, but because they discovered a method of unlearning submission. Fast forward to now. The plantation has become a timeline. You scroll, you react, you conform. Each tap, each like, each silence is a confession whispered to an algorithm built to measure your limits. It doesn't care what you believe, only that you stay predictable. Predictability is profit. Predictability is peace. So you shape your tone to fit the feed. You swallow opinions that might disturb your audience. You replace curiosity with performance. And somewhere between posts, you stop noticing that the architecture has moved inside your skin. This is the system of self, a lattice of habits that tells you when to speak, what to desire, and which fears are acceptable. It praises moderation while punishing deviation. It rewards agreement with visibility. It calls obedience balance. The Caldwells' last recorded phrase, root and branch, was their answer to that system. It meant, trace everything back to its origin, then watch how it branches into you. Which part of your certainty is inherited? Which impulse to stay silent was planted by someone who needed your silence to live? The point is not rebellion for its own sake. It's awareness. Because once you see how the system builds itself inside you, you can begin to dismantle it piece by piece, without rage, without permission, until what remains is your own unmediated perception. That's the real forbidden knowledge. Freedom isn't something you gain, It's something you remember, and once remembered, it can't be taken away again. Walk down any street, scroll any feed, step into any conversation. Everywhere you look, people are holding mirrors. Phones, profiles, performances, reflections angled toward each other, each person watching for recognition, terrified of deviation. This is the mirror age, the era when identity is not built, but reflected back. When you begin to measure reality by how much of it agrees with your reflection. In the Caldwell journals, one phrase repeats, "We see ourselves through their eyes no longer." That sentence reads like rebellion, but it's also survival. Because once a culture teaches you to live through mirrors, you will defend your reflection even when it no longer looks like you. That's why the system endures. The mirror gives comfort, and comfort buys consent. You post, they praise. You hesitate, they vanish. And slowly, you become the curator of your own illusion, pruning away every thought that might not photograph well. In the 19th century, mirrors were rare. You could live a life without ever knowing your own face precisely. Now, you are surrounded by them. Digital glass, feedback loops, metrics of worth. Every mirror demands maintenance. Every reflection demands agreement. And the more reflections you maintain, the less of you remains behind the glass. The Caldwells saw it first in their father's gaze, the way his approval built their existence. When they turned away from him, they didn't just defy a man, they shattered the mirror he held over their world. That's why history erased them. Because when mirrors break, people start to see directly. The mirror age offers you a choice. Either live by reflection, or remember that you are not made of glass. To see clearly is to accept distortion, to watch the cracks widen and still not look away. It's not comfortable. But every generation that reclaims its vision pushes the system one step closer to collapse. If you followed this far, you already feel the fracture, that faint shift inside you when you realize how many of your beliefs are borrowed light. That's the beginning. That's perception, learning to breathe again. The next part of the descent will show where all mirrors lead, to the centers of power that design them, and the moment when reflection becomes replacement. Every civilization reaches the same quiet threshold, the moment when the image becomes easier to manage than the thing it imitates. That's when replacement begins. In the Old South, the image of order mattered more than justice. In our age, the image of progress matters more than truth. What cannot be marketed is minimized. What cannot be simplified is silenced. You don't destroy complexity. You outsource it to illusion. Replacement starts small. A school lesson shortened, a headline rewritten, a memory flattened into an aesthetic. Soon, an entire century fits into a slogan, and once an event is smaller than its summary, it can be replaced altogether. That's what the Caldwell legend became, a story about forbidden love instead of a record of rebellion. Safe, romantic, marketable. The scandal survived. The message did not. That's how systems eat their threats. They dress them in nostalgia and sell them back to you. Look around. You're surrounded by replicas, history reenacted, outrage scheduled, authenticity simulated in HD. You've been taught that representation is redemption. But representation without truth is just camouflage. That's the modern plantation, an economy of symbols. Everyone is free to speak, but only in the approved dialect of performance. You can post your dissent as long as it fits the platform's proportions. The structure smiles and calls it empowerment. But here's the fracture point. Every replacement needs an original to hide. The Caldwells vanished so that the system could claim they never existed. Yet their pattern, the two rings, keeps returning because replacement can't destroy what it imitates. It can only distract from it. So ask yourself, which parts of your life are replicas you've mistaken for the real? Which freedoms are simulations designed to keep you content? And what would happen if, for 1 hour, you refuse to perform them? Replacement ends the moment authenticity becomes more valuable than approval. That's why authenticity is the one currency every system tries to counterfeit. The next descent will show what happens when people begin to notice the counterfeit, how exposure spreads through the structure like a fault line, and how control shifts from the architects to the awakened. Awakening doesn't happen in crowds. It begins in one mind, then another, tiny fractures along a surface that once seemed unbreakable. Every question left unanswered is a hairline crack. Every silence noticed is a fault line. In Wilkes County, long after the house had vanished, people still swore the ground there shifted after storms. A low tremor that rattled dishes miles away, though there was never any earthquake recorded. The old men said it was the orchard breathing. Maybe it was just the earth remembering what it was made to hold. That's what awareness feels like, a subtle tremor under your routines. You go to work, you scroll, you speak the expected words, and somewhere beneath all that, something starts to hum, a feeling that maybe the rules aren't laws at all, just agreements repeated long enough to sound eternal. That's the moment institutions dread, because control depends on rhythm, and awakening changes the tempo. When enough people pause, even for a second, the whole rhythm falters. A meme, a headline, a conversation at the wrong dinner table, and suddenly, certainty doesn't feel as solid as it used to. The first tremors look harmless. A drop in trust metrics, a book read too widely, a leak that refuses to disappear. But those tremors travel. Every algorithm is built to predict repetition, not revelation, and so it stutters when people begin to ask questions it can't categorize. That's how systems crack, from inside their own efficiency. You can see it everywhere now. In the tone of media that sounds more like reassurance than reporting, in the exhaustion behind people's laughter, in the quiet withdrawal from endless noise. The system mistakes fatigue for loyalty, but fatigue is just clarity with no language yet. That's the real fault line, not revolution in the streets, but recognition in the mirror. The moment a man realizes his compliance was never consent, that his reflection doesn't belong to him. And when that realization spreads, no structure, digital, political, or psychological, can remain the same. Because cracks are contagious. They travel through generations, like sound through glass. And each time someone speaks a forbidden truth aloud, the architecture above them shivers. The next descent will show what lies after the fracture, how systems adapt or die, and how the power once used to control can be reclaimed as something entirely new. After any fracture comes the quietest moment, the pause when everyone waits to see whether the structure will hold or fall. What most don't realize is that collapse and creation are the same motion seen from two different angles. Reclamation doesn't begin with fire or slogans. It begins with attention, with the simple act of looking directly at what you were taught to glance past. When people finally began to speak the Caldwell names aloud again in the late 20th century, the ground didn't open, the sky didn't fall. The stories changed shape. Teachers began mentioning the twins not as rumor, but as evidence of how ordinary people test the edges of the possible. Students drew the orchard as a symbol of renewal, not curse. And in every retelling, the meaning shifted a little further from shame and closer to understanding. That is reclamation, taking the narrative back from fear. In your own life, it looks smaller, choosing curiosity over conformity, pausing before you repeat what everyone else insists is obvious, listening for your own voice beneath the chorus. Each act of honest perception is a fragment of power reclaimed. The system expects resistance to look loud. It has defenses built for anger, for spectacle. What it cannot defend against is clarity. Because clarity asks no permission and demands no audience. It simply sees. That's why the Caldwell's legacy still hums through the culture that tried to erase them. It survives not as bloodline, but as practice. The discipline of remembering that authority lives only as long as you lend it your disbelief in yourself. Reclamation isn't revenge, it's repair. It's the moment when you stop needing the old story to make sense and start building meaning from your own direct experience. When you do, control in all its forms, political, digital, personal, loses its footing. Because nothing built on forgetfulness can survive being remembered. The two rings, root and branch, were never symbols of rebellion alone. They were instructions. Know where you come from, know what grows from you. Hold both truths in one breath, and the chain between them dissolves. The next and final descent will close the circle, not with answers, but with orientation. What it means to walk through history awake and to live among illusions without belonging to them. History is not a line. It is a circle that waits for someone to notice where it joins. If you've followed every step of this descent, you've already crossed the threshold that the Caldwells did when they stepped beneath the oaks. The point where curiosity becomes awareness and awareness becomes responsibility. That is the real forbidden place. Not a secret chamber, not a hidden file, but the space inside you that no system can occupy. The plantation, the archive, the algorithm, all of them were built on the same assumption that people forget, that a population busy, reflecting and performing will never stop to ask who designed the mirrors. But once you see the design, the spell breaks. The tower of control loses its foundation, not because it is destroyed, but because it is understood. Understanding is the quietest form of revolt. It doesn't shout. It simply refuses to kneel. Imagine the circle closing now, the twins in their vanished orchard, the scholar alone in a basement decades later, you, sitting here, eyes tracing these words. Different centuries, same recognition, that the architecture of power only stands as long as people mistake it for shelter. Outside that illusion, the air feels strange at first, thin, uncertain. Then you realize it's just freedom, unfiltered, no curator, no permission slip, just the weight of your own sight returning to you. That's where the story was always meant to end, not in tragedy, but in continuity. Every act of remembering pulls the past a little closer, folds it into the present, until history is no longer something that happened, but something you are still finishing. So walk forward with the two rings in mind. Root, what grounds you, what you've been taught. Branch, what you reach for once you know it. Hold them together. Carry them quietly. And whenever you feel the world tightening around you, whisper what the Caldwells wrote in the margins of their final page. We were never meant to be kept. Then keep moving, because now the circle is closed and you are part of the pattern that will not be erased again.